Sports Journal that comes out every Friday. I'm fortunate to be on it. And he's the one who gave me the idea today to start with Ali Frazier. Again, Teddy Atlas and Tim Ryan. He gave me that idea too. Will join us on Monday on the actual anniversary of the fight. But let's get some tidbits from a broadcasting standpoint of what this fight meant in America in 1971. And the great Dave says hello. Mr. Halberstam, nice to have you with us here finally. How are you today, pal? Okay?
I'm doing great, Chris. Always good to talk with you.
Always good. First off, where were you that night on March 8th, 1971?
I borrowed my dad's car, and I was driving around trying to get as many updates as I possibly could. And the best way to do it that night in New York City was to listen to one of the two all-news radio stations. You got to remember that at that point, not only was there no television, but there was no radio. And the only way you got the fight or any information on the fight was to listen, from what I recall, to the two all-news radio stations. And again, if I remember correctly, Chris, WINS did its sports at a quarter after and a quarter before, and WCBS did it 10 after and 20 minutes before the hour. So I listened and picked up as much as I could as I was driving around Brooklyn in my dad's old car.
Wow, how about that? Now I want you to give them a little historical feel here of how the rights were negotiated and how the broadcasters were picked. You wrote about it today. It was a lot of good tidbits in there. Give them a little sense of how they picked the announcers, Dumpy and Archie Moore and Lancaster. In fact, Tim Ryan. Give them a little feel of that, Dave. It's fascinating from a historical standpoint. Go ahead.
Sure. So with Don Dunphy, I mean, he was the voice of boxing, no question of that. When Adam Hatch lost the rights back in 1941, they went to Gillette, and there was a competition for who would get that gig, and they had an audition. Don Dunphy was in it. Mel Allen was in it, and it was a fight between a couple of fighters who had difficult last names, call them multisyllabic, and Mel and the other broadcasters, they stumbled and stammered through the audition, and Don Dunphy smartly just used those fighters' first names, and he was selected, and I'd say for the next 40 to 50 years, he was the voice of boxing in the U.S. So now the fight is arranged, and Jerry Perenchio, who few people heard of in those days, was the promoter of the fight. The fighters themselves, Frazier and Ali, insisted that the fight be held at Madison Square Garden. Initially, the Garden themselves went out to try to get the rights as promoters of the fight, but they lost when they, I believe, had a bid in for about $1.25 million a fighter, and Perenchio came along and doubled it. And he was an entertainment guy, and he represented Andy Williams, he represented Burt Lancaster and others, and everybody thought, okay, well, he'll have one of the guys he's representing, be it an actor or be it a singer, to do the fight. So they had this big news conference at Toots Shor's on December 30th, and Ali and Frazier, of course, were there, and Dunphy was invited by the Garden, and he was introduced to Perenchio. They exchanged some pleasantries. That was about it. But when he left the press conference, he said to himself, I'm going to get this gig. But he thought about it, and he said, well, Ali and Howard Cosell were very close, and Cosell was very supportive of Ali, and Ali was certainly a controversial figure then. Even the writers, guys like Dick Young, although Ali had changed his name from Cassius Clay, they insisted upon calling Ali Cassius Clay, although he had changed his name. So the camp of Muhammad Ali was pushing, of course, for Howard Cosell to get the fight. And also, Dunphy's concern and fear was that Perenchio was a West Coast guy. He would want Chick Hearn, who was the voice of the Lakers, had done a lot of boxing, for him to do the fight. But he had a good agent, and he persisted. He got a meeting with Perenchio. They met at the St. Regis Hotel, and one thing led to another, and he was hired. But at that meeting, Dunphy asked Perenchio, he says, is it true Andy Williams is going to be involved with the fight? And Perenchio laughed. He said, well, maybe he'll sing the national anthem, but he won't be in the fight. Now, the one other thing he said at that meeting, he said, Burt Lancaster knows a lot about boxing. So Correcchio, the promoter, was trying to convince Dunphy that Lancaster should be the guy, and eventually was. And he said, Burt and I were watching a fight a couple of weeks ago that involved Ali, and Cosell was talking so much, Burt and I kept screaming at the set. So he knew Cosell was out, and long story short, it was Dunphy, Archie Moore, and, as you said, Burt Lancaster.
And now in that, Dunphy got paid $5 million for that fight, and Ray Scott only got paid $800 for a Super Bowl? That's fascinating. Give him a little rundown on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. So Ray Scott, who was a great voice of football on CBS in the 70s, I heard him say something later in life that the biggest mistake he made was he never had an agent. And the most money he ever made for a single event was doing the Super Bowl for $800. And I'm not going to say he died penniless, and I wasn't privy to any of his finances, but I don't think he did that well in his position. It was a totally different time. Now, Dunphy had his agent, Bill Cooper, ask of Correcchio $10,000. Now, remember, this is 50 years ago, and people didn't make $10,000 all year. And Dunphy was afraid that if he asked for too much money, he won't get the gig. And they settled on $5,000, which in his book, Dunphy says that was the most anyone would make to that point for a single event. So he got $5,000. Of course, there was a lot of work that went into it, more than just the one event, but that was it. I mean, the guys didn't make big money back then. If you talk to Kurt Gowdy and others, it wasn't until much later that you see guys, like Stephen A. Smith make $8 to $10 million. That was certainly unheard of, even if you factor in inflation.
All right, now, we did a lot of this already today, Dave. I want you to help me out with the historical importance of the event. You can make an argument that in the 20th century, that's the biggest sporting event. Forget the world. I'm just concerned about the United States. But you can make the argument that that's the biggest sporting event up into this, in the whole century. I mean, I already got Schmeling and Lewis. You'll go through that in 38. Seabiscuit and War Admiral. We talked about that a little bit today. Army-Navy 46-0-0 tie, Yankee Stadium. Maybe a Jack Johnson fight. Bird Magic a little bit in 79. Go through a few of these. Would you classify the Ali Frazier fight on that level in the 20th century as far as importance is concerned and hype? What's your take on that?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, there was always a matter of politics involved. And if you look at another article that's in there today that I put in beyond the first one, that sort of gives you the whole history, Steve Albert is in there, and Brian Gumbel talks about the political importance as well. He was a guy, Ali, who was irrepressible, a guy who spoke his mind. And Frazier really represented more of the middle class. He had that profile that he was a little more docile, so to speak. I would say that in my lifetime, and I'm 69, it was the biggest event I've ever experienced in sports. I mean, sure, if you were in New York or you waited for Super Bowl III and Joe Namath's guarantee, but I would say from a standpoint of one event, yes. And I wasn't around, for Lewis and Schmeling. Now, that one had to be unbelievable. And all the material I was able to read, it was because, you had a German community here on the Upper East Side of New York, and you had what was going on in Germany, and it was pretty well documented at that point as to what was going on there, although Schmeling ended up not really being so supportive. That's why I use the word ostensibly representing Hitler's Germany. But that event had to be huge. But here's the thing. You didn't have anything but radio back then, and it did a 63 rating. That 63% of the United States was listening to that fight between Schmeling and Lewis. 300 million people around the world watched the Ali Frazier one. So you can argue that back and forth. I probably, even though I wasn't there, Maybe it's because of the great political importance of that fight and racial importance as well. And back in 71, too, you might argue that it was pro-Nixon, it was war, pro-war or anti-war when it came to Vietnam. And then, of course, the racial situation. Ali stood up for who he was. He had joined the Nation of Islam, and of course that was a controversial organization at the time. So, yeah, I mean, it was enormous too. But I would say those are probably the two based on all the reading I've done and what experience I've had. You can go back to Game 7 of the World Series, many of them, but it didn't have the build-up. It just didn't have the build-up. This had the ramp-up time, more so than a Super Bowl. The fight was announced December 30th, and they fought it on March 8th. 3 months. The subject of conversation, all those months, it was there. And
what they each
didn't
get
have it with anything else.
What they each get paid for that fight, Dave?
I believe that it was $1.25 million. I would say I know this, that Parenchio and Cook, I think they took in $7 million, and after everything, they made less than $1 million. My guess is they made about $2 million each, because the Garden had come in offering each fighter $1 million, and he doubled it. So it was about $2 million, I'd say, per fight.
All right, now, how does Sinatra get in the mix? How did Elizabeth Taylor get a seat? I mean, Clyde Frazier with the mink coat. I mean, every big, and I know the big star loves to go to the big boxing event that's been going on for 100 years. I get that, but boy, that's an eclectic class there at the Garden on that night on a Monday on March 8th. Give me a little rundown on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, that was. I think it was best put in Tim Ryan's book. I think he said it was sort of an extravaganza, sort of a mix of a big sporting event, Oscar night, a Broadway opening. And yes, he asked about Sinatra. He was hired smartly by Life magazine, which was huge back then, to take pictures. And Sinatra said to himself, boy, that's a great idea. I'll be right at ringside for the fight. And he was snapping away. And that's how he got in. And, of course, you had the governors and the mayors and anybody who meant anything was at the fight. And it was impossible to get a ticket. On Monday, I'm going to have a piece with Bob Costas, and he was a student at Syracuse. And he went to downtown Syracuse, and for $5, he bought a ticket and watched the fight. But, maybe back then, I don't remember what was in Brooklyn, $20 or $25, and I probably didn't have it. I was a college kid myself, so I was there driving around. And it's interesting, too, by the way, about that fight, and I don't know if Ryan told you the story. Parenchio would not allow the Armed Forces Network, a non-commercial network, and all those poor soldiers fighting in Vietnam to listen to the fight, because he was afraid the minute you had any opportunity to follow the fight on radio, you wouldn't buy a ticket to the closed circuit show. So essentially, he and the Department of Defense, Parenchio went to the Department of Defense and ordered $250,000 back in those years to allow the troops to hear the fight. They finally agreed, and they wouldn't allow the fight to be aired around the world at all the military bases, but only in Southeast Asia where, the war was raging.
Wow.
So,
how about that?
It was, and that happened at the last second. And now Ryan got the job. You might have asked him, but
he's on Monday.
The Rangers
he's on Monday. Ryan's on Monday. But go ahead. Tell us how Tim got the job. Let me hear.
Yeah, well, Tim got the job because he was doing the Rangers that year. He was solid broadcast. If you go through the history of network television, there probably wasn't a more sophisticated, versatile broadcaster. I think he did 30 sports and covered them in 20 countries. He did, of course, a lot of tennis, the Stanley Cup, but he was doing the Rangers in 1970, and Jack Price, who was running Madison Square Garden broadcasting, said to him, Mutual Radio wants to do a boxing series of all the fights at Madison Square Garden. So he was doing them. And then there was no radio planned anywhere, but New Zealand, the country of New Zealand, did not have any television of the fight, to my knowledge. So they wanted to run a radio, an English version, a radio version, over their public radio system in their country. So they called Jack Price, and it was approved by the Parencio and Jack Kent Cook, who was also one of the promoters, that allow that. And they didn't have the money to fly an announcer over from down under. So they asked Jack Price at the Garden who could do this fight. He picked Ryan. So Ryan had a few days to get ready for that fight. And then they finally settled the issue between Armed Forces Radio, meaning the Defense Department, and the promoters, to allow the fight to go to the troops. And they didn't have an announcer either. So they took Tim Ryan's feed. And that's how Tim Ryan wound up being the only guy in the Garden that night who was doing English radio.
How about that? Unbelievable.
Yeah.
David Halberstam. Boy, I told you he's great. David Halberstam is absolutely superb here on the Ali Frazier fight 50th anniversary on Monday. And the aforementioned Ryan will join us on Monday at Head Start the show, and then Teddy Atlas a little later on Monday as we sort of chronicle this event. Let's talk about closed circuit for a second. When did closed circuit begin? When could you start, if you were a sports fan in the 60s, when could you start, David, going to a closed circuit sporting event? It wasn't just at this fight. You could start it earlier than that. Give me a little history of closed circuit television for the big sporting event. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, a lot of it had to do with technology, and I do think, and that's not my area of expertise, but I think there were a lot of events that came in to the communities where there were European immigrants who wanted to watch soccer. And that's really how it began, and that's how closed-circuit broadcasting of sports started. But, you know, you talk about Parencio, who is really the guy who had the brains to put this all together. He made his money. He died, I'm trying to remember, maybe 15 years ago. And he made his money in cable. And this was sort of the start of it, because cable didn't exist then. All you had in those days, you had AM radio, you had over-the-air television, which in most markets meant the 3 network affiliates, and you had the daily newspaper, and you had Sports Illustrated. You didn't have FM. FM didn't really come into becoming popular until the 1970s. And you had, and then of course, cable in '79 with CNN and ESPN, and then satellite, and then of course everything else like streaming, which we're enjoying today. But you had none of that back then, which made radio great, because radio was where the announcers really always shined. And Dunphy did a lot of radio, and then did television or closed circuit for this. But closed circuit didn't really have to last, because now you can buy any fight if you want from your cable provider. So that was the beginning of it, but the transition with technology grew that.
Did people go around? Did people pack movie theaters all over America to watch this fight? I guess they probably did, right? They spent the $20. You mentioned Costas.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure